Recording. Hi, everyone. I'm Ruth Gomberg-Munoz here with Dr. William Lopez. Dr. Lopez is an assistant clinical professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and the author of the fabulous book, Separated: Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid. Thank you so much for talking with me about your book today.
Happy to be here. Yes, here's the cover of the book, and I want to first start out by thanking you, Ruth, for the interview and opportunity to speak about it, as well as students in the class for reading and discussing it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This book, as you know, sort of blows my socks off. I've been using it since it came out a year ago. And so I was hoping that we could start maybe by you just telling us a little bit about the book and what made you write it.
Sure. So this book chronicles the lives of three undocumented Latina mothers who responded, or rather who reacted to a raid on their apartment. And what happened is, after a day-long act of immigration enforcement, their apartment was ultimately raided by a combination of SWAT and ICE. ICE arrested about a dozen people throughout the day, and ultimately about 6 were deported. And what I focus on in the book is not so much the deportations of men, which was fairly common during the Obama era, but the ripple effects to the community, which especially hits women, undocumented women, in challenging ways as we see their social networks and social support systems fragment out of fear of deportation and fear of continued surveillance and arrest. I wrote the book specifically to push us to think more about what those effects are that we don't see, right? So often we focus on the acute violence, the deportation, or in current cases, police violence and extrajudicial killings. And what we miss is the slow and chronic violence and dehumanization that allows these things to occur. So these effects last all year, and they're rooted in the political rhetoric that allows it to happen. We see this in the case that we'll talk about in a bit of Breonna Taylor being killed after the police in those cases enacted the same warrants that I focus on in Separated.
You know, in addition to the really powerful stories of women and their children, one of the things that makes Separated such a strong book to teach with and to think with is that you also focus on police, right? And so you do a ride along and are trying to sort of understand how police enact and interpret their cooperation with immigration agents. And of course, as you mentioned, with the killing of Breonna Taylor and, dozens of people, Black men and women mostly recently, there's been this renewed attention to police violence. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you hope readers gain from reading Separated in this political moment when people are mobilizing around precisely the issues that your book speaks to.
Right. So when I started doing the field work for Separated, this was during the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. This was shortly after the killing of Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown. And that obviously wasn't the plan to be doing this, as often happens in our field work, right? We plan our field work and a political moment happens while we're doing it. But what this meant is that I had scheduled ride-alongs for the police, and what police ended up doing is telling me about their feelings and their thoughts on Black Lives Matter and on the killing of Black men and one boy. And I say Black men and boys because at the time, that's primarily who it was. And they talked to me about how they justified this, what was happening. So I was put in this position of thinking I was going into a situation to see how police talked about ICE and collaborating with ICE, and being told instead how they justified the killings of the Black men in our community. So it was a notable situation to be in, and what I saw among the police is something that I think is often reflected in the way the community thinks about these things. Police saw ICE enforcement and law enforcement and police enforcement, as two fundamentally different things, right? And part of what we see as immigration researchers, especially in the Midwest, so I'm in Michigan, others are in, central the US, folks are still being detained and deported. And it's not like we have the green uniform troops, La Migra or ICE driving around our communities. It's police generally putting people into our jails, right? Someone is doing this enforcement. Police do not see themselves as the people doing this enforcement. I often suggest that folks think about, so I can say defund ICE, and you can say defund the police, and you get two really fundamentally different reactions, right? And a lot of the reason for that is because people recognize ICE as the people who go in and separate families and take people away. They don't think of police in the same way. But in communities of color, they know very well that that's what police do. They surveil, they arrest, they separate families, and they incarcerate. So when I'm speaking to a larger public, I see, just like the police did, they see immigration enforcement and they see policing as fundamentally different things. And what I want to show in the book is that both of these are rooted in surveillance. Both of these coerce communities through the threat of violence that sometimes happens. But both of these fundamentally revolve around dehumanizing our communities of color. To wrap up, right, I could talk about this all day long or multiple hundreds of pages worth. But these strategies include, for Latinos, we'll use narcotraficantes or drug dealers. We know the terms like thug, right, or gangster are frequently used in these communities. And we also see in Muslim communities the use of the word terrorist, and I'll use air quotes because these, of course, are not my words. These are words that we hear that are used to dehumanize and position these communities as criminals to justify our violent enforcement.
Yeah, no, I love that the book makes a really compelling argument for the ways in which policing, racialized policing affects communities of color, not in the same ways, right? But in sort of in overlapping ways. It really points towards ways in which we can cooperate with each other as we mobilize politically around these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that the book came out a year ago, which means that you probably did the fieldwork for it a couple of years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in the interim? What are you working on now?
Sure. So this book, this book focused on a home raid. And at the time of writing it, we weren't seeing in our country these large scale immigration work raids. So a work raid, like a good example, the one that most people think of is like in Postville, Iowa, when a meatpacking plant was raided and over 200 folks were removed, right? We thought those were things of the past because of the scale and the fallout that happened. As a community, as a country, we generally acknowledge that, like, man, there's a lot of shit that happens after those kind of raids, right? On the small scale, we hadn't, which is why, we wanted to think about and reflect on that. But we see in the Trump administration that we return to those large scale raids. So our current work, we interviewed folks at 6 sites that of large scale work raids that happened in 2018. And I always think we think of our research like intellectually and what is our research question and such. And sometimes we ignore how much just emotion fits into what we're studying and what we're doing. And this book was taxing, was emotionally draining, and was hard. And it was also kind of dark, right? I consider myself as a public health researcher. My job is to diagnose and tell you about illness and sickness. And what I wanted to do here is diagnose and tell you extensively about social illness and social sickness, which is the way we enforce immigration law. And in my current research project, I don't want to do that. I'm a little tired. And I'm sure you feel this, Ruth, and others feel it as well. How much evidence do we need that this stuff is bad for people? Like, how many different ways do you want me to document this, right? Like, I'm just fatigued at documenting it. Not to say that you or others shouldn't, but personally, I want to extend to the other parts of this story. And part of that story is that after immigration raids happen, there are lots of negative impacts, but communities don't just sit there, right? Communities respond, they react, they're creative, they're innovative, and they care for each other. And we need to figure out what ways they do that so that we can also support them in those ways. And some of us are from these communities. We know how it happens, and we want to bring this out into the world so that other communities can respond the same. It's a long-winded way to say that we interviewed folks at each of these sites who were involved in responses to the raid to see how communities, survived and sometimes thrived despite this government-sanctioned persecution and removal.
I think that's actually a beautiful place to end it. And I just want to thank you again for your really important work and for everything that you do. And I know you do a lot of community work too. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. So students won't know that this was our 3rd attempt at this. We switched floors, we switched computers. We're all dealing with spotty Wi-Fi, but we accomplished it. So thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for reading, and I look forward to discussing it more.
Yes, definitely.
Bye.